don't need to remember anything tonight. Not a single date. Not a single name. Tonight is not for remembering. It's for letting go. So close your eyes, or just let them grow heavy. Let the outside world grow dim, and allow a quieter one to take its place. Somewhere, in the soft folds of darkness behind your eyelids, the fog is beginning to rise. And in that fog, a world from long ago takes shape. Not a world of kings and queens, not a world of knights and legends, but of someone forgotten, someone who stood beside kings, yet never truly mattered to them, someone whose job was to make others laugh, even when he himself had forgotten how to smile. Tonight you're stepping gently into the life of a medieval court jester, not the silly, bright-colored cartoon jester you've seen in books, not the happy-go-lucky clown with bells on his hat and jokes at the ready. The real story is quieter and darker and sadder than most people think. You're not here to be entertained. You're not here to laugh. You're here to drift, to relax, and to feel what it might have been like, to live behind the smile. So take a slow breath in and let it out, like a sigh that's waited all day to be free. Your body, perhaps, has done enough today. And your mind, it deserves a break from pretending, just like the jester did. You might hear the faint echo of bells in the distance, or the creak of old stone hallways, maybe the whisper of a curtain being drawn aside. Don't chase them, don't follow, they'll come to you. Let them come slowly, because in this story, no one's rushing, not even the jester. He's tired too. So lay down your thoughts, lay down your fears, lay down your need to be anything more than resting. The fire is low, the night is long, and the story is just beginning. Before the jester ever made anyone laugh, he was something else. A child, a stranger, a wanderer. Someone born not into applause, but into silence. He didn't grow up dreaming of making a king smile. Most likely, he didn't dream at all. He simply survived. He may have grown up in a small village, where the winters were hard and the food was thin, where stories were told by the fire, and no one was ever truly alone, but no one was ever truly safe either. He may have been different. A strange walk, a strange face, a strange way of seeing the world. And in those days, difference wasn't admired. It was marked, it was noticed, and it was often sold. There were traveling performers who visited towns, acrobats, fire breathers, musicians. Sometimes they brought laughter. Sometimes they brought fear. Sometimes they brought opportunity. They might see a boy juggling stones in a courtyard, or mimicking the mayor's voice when no one was looking, or turning pain into comedy in a way no child should know how to do. And they might say, "He has talent," but what they really meant was, "He can be shaped." And so the boy would be taken, not always against his will, but never quite with full understanding either. He would leave behind dirt roads and familiar voices and begin a life of movement. From village to village, court to court, tent to tent, always the next show, always the next laugh. Over time, he'd be given a costume, bright colors, a hat with bells, shoes that curved at the toes. He'd be taught to bow, to dance, to rhyme, to read the room like a map no one else could see. He learned that laughter was currency, that timing was survival, that when people smiled, they didn't ask questions. He learned to speak without saying what he meant, to point without blaming, to tell truths through nonsense, because nonsense was safer. He became a mirror in motion, reflecting whatever the room needed. Never too honest, never too dull, always just enough. But not every jester began with talent. Some were chosen not for their wit, but for their difference. There were courts that believed deformity was divine, that people who looked unusual were touched by fate, that the gods had twisted them for a reason, and that reason, somehow, was amusement. It is cruel to say. It was cruel to do. And yet, it happened. There were jesters with curved backs, with trembling hands, with speech that wavered. They were laughed at not for what they said, but simply for who they were. They did not perform. They were the performance. And the court clapped anyway. Others were prisoners, spared from execution in exchange for servitude. If they could make the king laugh, they lived. If they couldn't, well, the axe was already sharp. There were orphans, too. Boys and girls taken in by lords who wanted entertainment with no family strings. Children raised in silk, but never allowed to speak their own names. They became jesters not because they were born to perform, but because they had no other path, no inheritance, no claim, no voice, except the one that made others laugh. Still, the court needed them, not because it was kind, but because it was tense. Power is a heavy thing. It needs pressure valves. It needs distractions. It needs someone to say what no one else can, and to take the fall if it lands poorly. The jester became that person, the safe target, the talking shadow, the fool who was no fool at all. He read the king better than the king's advisor. He read the room better than the guards at the gate. He knew who was afraid, who was angry, who was dangerous, and he used that knowledge not to control, but to survive. One joke at a time, one bow at a time, one breath closer to being forgotten, if he ever stopped being funny. To be a jester was not a job. It was a position, a presence, a shadow stitched into the corner of a throne room. He was not a guest, not quite a servant, not exactly family. He lived somewhere between them, welcome everywhere, belonging nowhere. He was there when the king awoke, there when the court gathered, there when a battle was won, there when a friend was lost. But no one asked how he felt about any of it. His role was simple and yet endlessly complex. Make it lighter. Make the morning less heavy. Make the failures less humiliating. Make the silence after a cruel decision feel a little less sharp. And so, he became a master of tone. He watched eyes. He watched wine levels. He watched who laughed too easily and who didn't laugh at all. He adjusted. Not just his jokes, but his breathing, his posture, his entire being. Because everything could be dangerous. A joke too pointed, he might offend a duke. Too dull, he might bore the queen. Too clever, he might remind the king how fragile power really is. So he walked a razor's edge. Every performance a test, every word a coin flipped in the air. Heads, laughter, tails, silence. And silence could be fatal. Most people don't know that jesters weren't always funny. They were sometimes musicians, sometimes poets, sometimes political messengers dressed in absurdity. Some were fluent in multiple languages, could recite histories backward, or deliver scathing truths wrapped in rhymes. There were even courts that required the jester to study philosophy, so that his jokes had weight. The kind that made lords shift in their chairs without knowing exactly why. But he couldn't be too wise. That was dangerous. Wisdom with bells on still threatens the throne, so he had to pretend not to know. At banquets, he'd perform between courses. When the nobles were full and sluggish, he had to wake the room with antics, juggling, wordplay, impersonations. When tensions rose between rival houses, he was told to lighten the mood, sometimes with a joke, sometimes with mockery, and always at the risk of his own standing. If he failed, he wasn't scolded. He was replaced, or worse, punished for ruining the harmony of the room. Imagine being the only one tasked with saving the tone of a kingdom, and having no armor but a painted smile. He was summoned for everything: birthdays, funerals, marriages, war councils. He once danced while generals planned invasions. He once told riddles to distract a grieving princess. He once made the queen laugh during her miscarriage because she asked him to. He didn't get to say no. Not to anything. Refuse a command, you insult the crown. Hesitate, you bring bad luck. Do too well, you draw envy. It was a game with no rules and no winners. But still, he tried. Because laughter, even forced, was safer than silence. Because if people were laughing, they weren't punishing. If they were amused, they weren't angry. And for someone without a title, without a family name, without a sword or land or inheritance, amusement was the only protection he had. There's an old phrase, one that never made it into history books, but lived quietly in the mouths of old fools. The fool who survives is the one who disappears at the right time. He learned to vanish when laughter died, to back away when the nobles grew drunk, to excuse himself before the king's mood shifted. He was not just a performer, he was a reader of danger. And his role? It wasn't to be funny. It was to keep the peace by sacrificing his dignity one punchline at a time. So the next time you imagine a jester with jingling bells and a lopsided grin, remember that the smile may have been chosen for him, that the joke was never his, that the performance was survival. The jester was the only man in the castle allowed to mock the king. That alone made him dangerous, not to others, but to himself. Because while jesters had the permission to speak freely, they didn't have the freedom to be wrong. One word misread, one moment misjudged, one laugh not loud. Enough. And everything could change. Imagine standing in a room lined with velvet and gold, light flickering across goblets of wine, every noble seated upright, pretending not to be afraid of the man on the throne. And in the center of it all, you, with bells on your sleeves, and nothing but your voice to keep you safe. You were there to lift the mood, to soften the tension, to remind us to laugh, even in war. But no one ever reminded them not to punish you for it. There are stories of jesters who crossed invisible lines, who mocked a duke's debt a little too clearly, who imitated a queen's nervous habits too well, who sang a rhyme that matched the king's failure a little too perfectly. The room would laugh, nervously, then pause, then turn. Eyes would shift toward the throne, waiting, measuring, fearing. And if the king laughed, you lived. If he didn't, you didn't. The danger wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it took hours, or days, or a week of cold glances and 2 quiet meals. Then, perhaps, you'd be summoned late one night, not to perform, but to be reminded that not all laughter is welcome. Perhaps you'd be told to leave the court, with no coin, no papers, no protection. Other times you'd simply be handed a cup of wine, and the taste would be just slightly off, enough to let you fall asleep, forever. Still, jesters walked the edge, because sometimes saying what others feared to say was the only way to feel alive, and sometimes kings wanted it. They wanted someone to say what their advisors wouldn't, to name what the nobles tiptoed around, to drop a truth so sudden it startled them into laughter, because even power craves honesty when it can control the one who speaks it. One jester, in the court of a German duke, once compared the duke's leadership to a candle in the wind. beautiful, bright, but easily extinguished. The hall went silent. The Duke stared. Then he laughed. Too hard, too long. And the next morning the Jester was sent to a distant province, promoted, they said, to entertain the peasants. But those who knew the court understood he'd gone too close, and the Duke was frightened by how close the candle had come to being blown out. Other times, jesters were used as pawns. The king might instruct a fool to humiliate a rival in public, to hint at a secret affair, to expose a failing military campaign, all under the safety of a rhyme. And if the joke landed badly, the king would smile and say, "He's only a fool, not worth your anger." But if it landed well, he'd nod and say, "Even a fool knows the truth." Either way, the Jester was the shield, the first to fall, the one blamed, even when he only spoke what was whispered in the throne room already. This was the real job, not to tell jokes, but to read danger like a map, to know who was having a bad day, to know which noble's child had just died, which courtier was rumored to be disloyal, which alliance was about to fall apart. And then, to laugh around it, to laugh through it, to make it seem like coincidence that your joke struck exactly where the tension lay. But even if the court didn't punish you, the weight of being constantly cautious wore down the bones of many jesters. Their backs stooped not from age, but from years of bowing at just the right angle, to just the right person, at just the right time. Their hands shook not from wine, but from holding the knife of a sentence without ever letting it fall. And their smiles were shields, worn down, polished too often, never quite reaching the eyes. The smile of the Jester was his most dangerous tool. It could win him safety, it could buy him time, but it could also end everything. Because the court never feared the joke, it feared the truth beneath it. And the smile that delivered that truth was often the last thing the Jester ever gave. There is a moment, after the laughter fades, when the Jester is alone. It's quiet. The candles have been snuffed. The wine has run dry. The nobles are gone. And in that emptiness, the Jester sits, his smile long gone, his hands still trembling from the rhythm of performance. He breathes, not as a fool, not as entertainment, but as someone trying to remember who he is when no one's watching. Because laughter is heavy. It looks light. It sounds bright. But when you carry it for others, day after day, moment after moment, it begins to bend you. Not like a sword, but like water. Slow and constant, wearing you down until you forget what your own voice sounds like when it's not trying to amuse. The Jester often laughed last, but only because he had no choice. He laughed when the court demanded. He laughed when the silence was dangerous. He laughed even when the joke was at his expense. He learned to laugh through pain, through grief, through humiliation. And worse, he learned to do it well, because survival depended on it. There are stories, quiet ones, not written in royal archives but passed between servants, about jesters who were ordered to perform while their loved ones were dying. One sang a bawdy song while his sister passed from fever in the next chamber. Another mimicked the king's enemy as news arrived that his own village had burned. He heard it. He felt it. He said nothing, because the king was watching, and the smile was more important than the scream. This was the skill no one talks about, not juggling, not rhyme, not mimicry, but the ability to split in half. To be two people, the one who feels and the one who performs, feeling. The second one always wins. Some fools became masters of disguise, not with makeup, not with costumes, but with emotion. They could seem joyful while hollow. They could tell jokes without hearing them. They could make others laugh while wondering if they themselves were still real. One jester wrote, in a letter never delivered, "I no longer know when I'm pretending. The laughter is louder than I am. I disappear when they smile." Another scribbled a phrase on his wall, "It's not the jokes that exhaust me. It's being the joke." These weren't the words of performers. They were the words of people taught to feel only what was permitted. The court saw the fool as bright, colorful, lively, but inside many were quiet, withdrawn, thoughtful to the point of sadness. Some stopped laughing entirely when alone. Others forgot how. They tried. They stood before mirrors, repeating old punchlines, waiting for a flicker of joy that never returned. There was no healing. Therapy did not exist. Understanding did not exist. Kindness, perhaps, but only when it didn't interfere with entertainment. So the jester did what he was trained to do. He performed until his voice gave out, until his knees ached, until his soul grew too tired to shine. And then he was replaced. Not always cruelly, sometimes gently, with a nod, a warm thank you, a whisper that he had served well. But that didn't change what he'd lost, because somewhere along the way, the jester had forgotten who he was when he wasn't trying to make someone else feel better. And tonight, if your body feels tired, but your mind still buzzes, know this: you're not alone. So many have worn smiles to protect themselves, to survive a moment, to get through a day, even if they couldn't remember what made them smile for real. You don't have to do that now. This night, no one is watching. No one is judging. No one is waiting for you to lighten the mood. You're allowed to rest, to not laugh, to not perform, to not please. You're allowed to sleep. Behind every throne is a corridor, and behind that corridor, a curtain. Not a velvet one drawn to signal the start of a play, but a quiet one, heavy with dust and silence. That is where the jester retreats. When the king is full of wine, the guests are gone, and the great hall flickers with dying candlelight. He does not remove his costume. He does not remove the bells from his hat. He simply sits and breathes again like a man. Because until then, he wasn't one. He was a mirror. He was a puppet. He was a symbol of joy in a place that rarely knew peace. And that weight, it doesn't disappear when the applause fades. It lingers in the joints, in the ribs, in the deep muscle of the heart. You see, the court jester wasn't just someone who told jokes. He was often the only person allowed to feel something in public, but only if that feeling was laughter. Grief, that belonged to widows. Anger, that belonged to kings. But laughter, that was his responsibility, to manufacture, to sustain, even when it felt like poison in his throat. There were days the jester had to perform while the queen wept behind the tapestry. Days when the castle was draped in black for a lost prince, and yet the bells on his costume still jingled through the hall. He would skip, he would spin, he would shout absurdities, because no one else knew how to speak when the air was full of mourning. And sometimes he didn't either, but silence was not his right. In some courts, the jester was forced to mock the dead, to lighten the weight of grief with crude impressions and biting rhymes. He might be ordered to impersonate a fallen general, to make the nobility laugh through their discomfort. Imagine being told to perform the voice of a man you once knew, while his family sat pale-faced nearby. Imagine being told to laugh, or worse, to make others laugh, when what you really wanted was to cry. But the curtain never opened for the jester's pain. It remained closed, and he was expected to play until the audience forgot their own. There are stories, not many because history rarely keeps them, of jesters who lost everything. One tale tells of a jester whose only son died in a fire. The morning after the funeral, the king demanded light entertainment at breakfast. The jester obeyed. He juggled apples until his hands bled from strain. He recited limericks that stumbled. Over his grief, he bowed so low he nearly collapsed, and when he was finally dismissed, he walked back to his cell, sat down, and did not rise again. No one spoke of him the next day. A new fool had already arrived. Another jester, once beloved by the queen, fell from favor when he joked too honestly about the kingdom's debts. The king, red with fury, declared him too clever to be safe. That night, he vanished. Some say he was exiled. Others say he was silenced. But in the kitchens, the rumor was simpler. The king doesn't like to be reminded that fools are watching. And yet, the irony? The jester often knew more than anyone in court. He watched everyone. He overheard secrets whispered between servants. He saw the way generals clutched their goblets too tight when war wasn't going well. He noticed which courtiers avoided the chapel, which ladies wept into their pillows at night. He collected truths like stones in his pocket, heavy, unnoticed, but always there. But truth was dangerous, so he hid it behind riddles, wrapped it in laughter, dressed it in rhyme. "Speak sense and they hang you," he might whisper. "Speak nonsense and they clap." Some jesters kept diaries, strange little books of coded jokes and upside-down poems. They wrote in metaphors, described nobles as animals, turned scandals into limericks, but none survived. If one was discovered, it was burned. No one wanted the fool to leave behind wisdom, only noise. Even his death could be a performance. There is a tale from the court of Hungary. A jester slipped on a spilled goblet during a feast, cracked his skull, and died instantly. The room went silent, then burst into laughter, thinking it part of the act. The king clapped, the guests cheered. Only the jester's apprentice knew it was real, and he was made to continue the show. The curtain is heavy, not because of fabric, but because of all the things it hides. And tonight, behind it, somewhere deep in your imagination, a jester waits, not to perform, but simply to be, to sit without a joke, to breathe without a rhyme, to be, for once, not entertaining, just human. And as you lie here, drifting deeper into rest, perhaps you offer him that moment, one without expectation, one without applause, one that doesn't end in a bell, only breath, only peace, only sleep. The life behind the bells is rarely a full one. To the court, the jester was not a man, nor a woman, nor something in between. He was a presence, a function, a noise that filled empty hours and softened hard truths. He had no right to fall in love. He had no right to grieve, or age, or hope. And yet he did. He was human after all, just one buried beneath masks, beneath expectations, beneath centuries of being forgotten. The court may not have asked about the jester's dreams, but that doesn't mean he didn't have them. He may have dreamed of quiet mornings, of bread still warm from the oven, of walking in the woods where no one knew his name, of laughter shared, not required. But dreams are dangerous when you are property, and that is what most jesters were. Property, owned, federal, expected, discarded. Their names were rarely recorded in the rolls of the court. Their birthdays weren't celebrated. They did not marry unless granted permission by the crown, and even then, it was often for show. Some jesters were neutered, literally or socially, to keep them from distracting the ladies of court. Others were shamed for expressing affection. Some were simply too strange, too other to be seen as worthy of love. And yet, a few found it anyway. Quiet glances between performances, fingers brushed while passing wine, letters slipped under doors. But secrecy is its own kind of prison, and in a world where reputation was everything, even the idea of a jester holding affection was dangerous. They were expected to be harmless, detached, whimsical, as if joy could only be pure if it came from someone with no stake in the world. But of course, jesters had feelings. They bled like anyone else. They wept when no one watched. They questioned why the laughter around them never reached inside. Some tried to leave, to disappear from the castle, to vanish into the woods, to live as farmers or tanners or traveling minstrels. But most were found. The court does not forget its performers, nor does it easily replace them. And for those who stayed, who served loyally until their backs curved and their voices weakened, there was rarely retirement. A few were granted quiet corners of the keep, allowed to tend to the dogs or serve in the kitchens, but many were simply replaced and forgotten, their costumes burned, their jokes passed to someone younger, louder, less broken. And what remained? Sometimes a bell, sometimes a staff, sometimes just a shadow in a painting, misnamed, unlabeled, just a blur behind the throne. The jester lived in between things, between humor and humiliation, between respect and ridicule, between being seen and being invisible. They didn't own land. They didn't have heirs. They rarely left anything behind but echoes. You might find their footprints in the margins of history books, a passing mention, a single verse of a lost poem, a strange figure in a tapestry holding a fool's stick. But their stories, they were meant to be forgotten, because remembering the jester means remembering what the court required from joy, that it be immediate, exaggerated, and never, ever reciprocal. There is one story, almost certainly false, but stories often are, of a jester who, nearing death, was asked by a priest if he repented his life of sin. The jester is said to have smiled weakly and whispered, "I lived as they wished. I died as I was forgotten. But for one night, I made a child laugh while she cried." Is that not enough for heaven? We don't know if he said it. We don't even know his name. But the image lingers. A man with bells on his wrists, a cracked voice, and a heart that once beat faster. When someone finally laughed with him, not at him. So as you lie here now, in a warm bed, free from performance, free from masks, know that someone once bore the weight of endless pretending just to bring others a moment's peace. Tonight, perhaps you return the favor by remembering him, by listening, not for a joke, but for the silence between them, by letting the world soften for a moment, and by falling gently into sleep. There is no grand funeral for the fool, no marble tomb, no bard to sing his praises, no crowds gathered in silence. When the jester dies, he exits quietly, often without applause, and sometimes people don't even realize he's gone. In the great courts of medieval Europe, death was both common and choreographed. For kings, it meant a week of mourning. For queens, a sea of black veils and psalms. But for the jester, his death might be mistaken for part of the show. There is one tale, perhaps a rumor, perhaps truth, of a jester in the court of Naples who collapsed mid-performance, his final joke unfinished, his eyes still dancing with effort. The nobles clapped. They thought it was a new routine. They thought his stillness was clever. By the time someone checked for breath, the laughter had already faded. And still, no one stood up. They simply waited for someone else to bring the next jester in. Some fools died alone, forgotten in back halls, wrapped in moth-eaten cloaks and silence. No one asked where they had gone. No one sent servants to fetch their things. Their rooms were cleaned, their costumes packed away, their bells passed on. It was easier that way. The court didn't like to dwell on endings, especially when the one who died was never meant to have a beginning. There are records, faint, barely legible, scrawled in margins of financial ledgers and royal inventories, that mark the disappearances of fools with words like replaced, dismissed, no longer in service. 3 words. That's all the world offered someone who had once made it laugh. Some jesters died violently, not because of war, but because of a joke told too boldly. A mocking song that cut too close to the queen's pride. A pun that reminded the king of a past failure. One wrong rhyme, one wrong laugh, and the jester was done. Not in shame, not even in scandal, just gone. Perhaps exiled, perhaps poisoned, perhaps thrown into a well no one would bother to name. The court was like that. It remembered what it wanted and erased the rest. But not all jesters died quickly. Some aged within the walls, their colors fading, their voices weakening, until they were no longer useful. And once they stopped being useful, they stopped being visible. You could pass them in the hall and not see them. You could sit near them at supper and forget they were there. They became ghosts before they died. Whispers with legs, bells that no longer rang. And sometimes the jester knew it was coming. The day when no one laughed. The day when even the king yawned. The day when the fool became boring. That was the most dangerous day of all. Because if you're not funny anymore, and you've never been anything else, what are you? Who are you? What do they do with a man whose only purpose was to make people forget the truth, when now he's the one reminding them of it? They send him away, or worse, they stop speaking his name. And so, in the final moments, the jester might retreat to a quiet corner, a forgotten stairwell, a storage room beneath the kitchens, a hallway no longer lit. He might sit with his old jokes, his worn-out shoes, his silent staff, and he might wonder, was it ever real? Was the laughter meant for him? Was the smile ever more than survival? He closes his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from understanding. The court didn't love him. It loved what he gave. And now that he has nothing left to give, there is only silence. But there is something peaceful in that too. No more bells, no more company, no more commands, no more pretending, just stillness. And in that stillness, perhaps, for the first time, he is free. Where the laughter ends and no one comes to visit, graves say a lot about the living. The rich have stones, tall ones, carved with prayers and crests. The noble have tombs sealed in cathedrals, guarded by silence. The kings, their resting places echo with music, surrounded by candles that never truly burn out. But the fool is buried beneath the dirt. No marker, no song, no name. Sometimes he is placed behind the stables, where the grass grows uneven and the rain leaves shallow pools. Other times, he is buried outside the castle wall, near the spot where firewood is chopped, where no one lingers long. Not because anyone hated him, but because no one remembered to care. The jesters were never meant to be remembered. That was part of their function. They existed in the moment, in the breath between punchlines, in the laugh that vanished as soon as it arrived. To remember the jester is to remember that the laughter was temporary, and the court didn't like reminders of impermanence. It liked pageantry and power and things that stood still, The fool was never still. He danced, he stumbled, he spun words into air. And so when he died, he was returned to the air again, unclaimed. There are places in England and France, in hidden corners of castle grounds, where no headstones stand, where the soil is uneven, the grass grows in patches, and there are no flowers. These places were not forgotten. They were ignored on purpose. They were where the servants were buried, the stable boys, the cooks who died too young, and sometimes the fools. Not even the grave diggers knew their names. They wrote down, man, unknown, entertainer, dead of cold, or small man, mismatched clothes, no unclaimed body. That was the jester's final applause, a line of text in a ledger, a patch of ground, a night that continued, as if nothing had changed. And yet, there were exceptions. In one castle in the northern hills of what is now Belgium, there's a crumbling stone barely legible. It says, "Here lies C." He made the children laugh. That's all. No date, no mention of court, no crown above the carving, just the simple truth. He made the children laugh. Perhaps he was kind. Perhaps he slipped jokes between meals. Perhaps he made a young princess smile after her mother's funeral. Whatever he did, someone remembered. Someone carved that stone. And someone, long ago, left flowers. In truth, most jesters didn't even get burial rites. They were often considered unclean by the church. They told lewd jokes. They mocked priests. They made fun of saints and sang irreverent songs. The clergy didn't want them buried in consecrated ground. Some were thrown into pauper pits, others left to the forest, to be returned to nature, which was a poetic way of saying forgotten. And yet, in their lifetimes, they had made kings laugh. They had been kissed by queens. They had heard secrets no monk would ever be allowed to know. But in death, nothing. Not even a marker. Not even a sigh. Just earth. Just silence. Just the long forgetting. Tonight, you rest in a bed. Perhaps it creaks softly. Perhaps a blanket warms your feet. Perhaps the air hums gently around you. But somewhere, beneath stones and time and leaves, lie those who made others smile and were never smiled at in return. You don't need to cry for them. They would not have wanted that. They might have preferred this. A quiet room, a listener, a final story told in peace. You've given them that just by being here. Let the unmarked graves rest. Let the stories that were never written drift like ash into the slow wind of memory. And let the next chapter begin, not in sorrow but in understanding. Because even the forgotten deserve to be felt. Some fools live too long, longer than the laughter, longer than the king who once found them amusing, longer than the memories of the jokes they once told. They became fixtures, faint shapes in the background of court life, a noise that no one truly heard anymore. The jester who lived too long became invisible in plain sight. There is a story not in any official chronicle, but passed down between kitchen maids and page boys of a jester who outlasted 3 kings. He had once been clever, sharp as the edge of a duel. He could rhyme in 4 languages, balance cups on his nose, and mimic the high bishop while making the queen blush. But kings age, crowns fall, and tastes change. By the time the 3rd king took the throne, the jester's clothes no longer fit. His jokes no longer sparked. His voice, once melodic and loud, now trembled at the end of every phrase. The court laughed less, then stopped altogether. And yet, no one dismissed him. He was too familiar, too harmless, too there. So he stayed, not as a fool, but as something else, something no one could quite define. a ghost in the daylight, a relic that still breathed. He slept in a small room near the scullery. No windows. A wooden bed with straw that creaked more than he did. He was not forbidden from leaving the castle, but he never did. Where would he go? He had lived behind stone and firelight his whole life. The outside world was louder, more dangerous, and worst of all, it didn't know who he was. Inside, at least, someone nodded as he passed. A page might bow from habit. A maid might leave an extra heel of bread. A stable boy might call him sir, not knowing why. But beyond the walls, he would be no one. Just a hunched old man in mismatched colors, with bells that no longer rang. And so he wandered the halls, at night, mostly when the castle was sleeping. He would drift from one chamber to another, remembering the jokes told long ago, repeating them softly to no one. Not to entertain, but to remember what his voice sounded like when it had purpose. He did not want to die. He simply didn't know what living meant anymore. He watched new jesters arrive, young, loud, confident. He smiled at them, tried to give advice. Watch the king's eyes, not his mouth, he'd say. Laughter begins in the pupils. Most ignored him. Some laughed at him. A few asked gently if he was still part of the court. He didn't know how to answer, because the court had forgotten to let him go. There were days when he tried to make himself useful. He offered to help the scribes with ink. He tried sweeping the floor with a crooked broom. He played soft music on a cracked flute, but his breath gave out halfway through. Eventually, they stopped asking him anything, and so he stopped offering. And in that quiet, he began to vanish, not in body, but in memory. No one asked where he slept. No one checked if he ate. He was like a painting on the wall, framed, present, unseen. Some might call this a mercy, to live peacefully, to be left alone. But the jester knew what it was. It was the slowest death of all, to be forgotten while still breathing, to be surrounded by voices, but never spoken to wear color, but feel invisible, to walk freely, but never be missed. He kept a small book, not of jokes, not anymore, just moments. A child waved at me today. The cook gave me warm broth. Someone laughed not at me, but near me. It felt close enough. It wasn't much, but it was his, and in those pages, he remained real, to himself, if no one else. When no one notices you're gone, there was no final act, no grand performance, no bell to signal the end. The old jester simply faded. He stopped wearing the hat, not out of rebellion, but because the weight of it pressed too deeply on his temples. He stopped humming his old tunes. They no longer landed where they used to. The rhythms drifted in his chest but refused to exit his mouth. And so, one evening, as the castle prepared for a visiting duke, with flags being raised and silver being polished, the jester stepped into a hallway no one used anymore. He stood beneath the window where, years ago, he'd once shouted a rhyme so clever the king had dropped his goblet from laughter. That window was closed now. The glass was cracked, and no one remembered the rhyme. He placed his hand on the stone, rough, cold, familiar, like the world had always been. And then, he kept walking, not far, not with purpose, just slowly, into the edges of the castle where the light didn't reach. For days, no one noticed. Why would they? He hadn't performed in years. He hadn't been needed. His absence was not a wound, just an empty chair that had always been there. The steward didn't ask. The maids assumed someone else had seen him. The cook left his usual bowl of broth near the scullery. It went cold. The new jester, loud, brilliant, bold, mentioned once in passing, "Isn't there an old one still about?" No one answered. No one remembered enough to care. By the time they found him, he had already become part of the stone. His back rested against a wall that hadn't felt warmth in years. His hands were folded. His eyes were closed. He looked at peace. There was no fear in his posture, no regret in his stillness. Just surrender, like someone who had held the pose for too long and was finally allowed to let go. The castle did not stop for his passing. No bells were rung. No candles lit. The Duke's visit went on as planned. The feast was lively. The jokes sharp. The music louder than usual. And yet, for those who paid attention, a strange stillness touched the corners of the hall. A slight delay in laughter. A pause before clapping, as if something had shifted, as if the room had lost a color it didn't know it had. They buried him behind the chapel, not within. He wasn't holy, he wasn't damned, he was simply other. They placed no stone. No one could recall his full name, only that he'd been there, always there, a presence, a pair of soft shoes, a low voice, a flash of color that had grown dull with time. And then, life went on. New kings came, new fools danced. The bells jingled again, but every so often when the fire was low and the wind whispered through the drafty halls, a sound could be heard, not laughter, not weeping, just breath, like someone remembering how it felt to be seen, just for a moment, as more than the joke. So if tonight, as you lie in the dark, you feel a flicker of something old, a story barely told, a footstep that doesn't belong, a presence without weight, perhaps it's not a ghost, perhaps it's memory. Not yours, but his, the Jester's, finally invited to rest, not to perform, not to smile, just to be. The castle is quiet now. The torches have burned low, casting shadows that sway like lullabies against the stone. The tables have been cleared, the wine has been drunk. The laughter, hours old, has softened into the walls. Even the bells are silent. There is no one left on stage, no one watching, no one performing, just stillness. And in that stillness, something begins to settle inside you too. You are not in a great hall, or a cold chamber, or even a wooden bed beneath tapestries. You are simply here, wrapped in breath, held in the folds of the night. The Jester's story is done. He does not need you to remember him. He only needed to be heard once more. And you did that. You were the witness he never had, the listener he always needed. For a moment, you gave weight to a life built of air. So now, it's time to let go. Let go of the names, let go of the crowns, let go of the colors and the sounds, let go of needing to understand everything. You don't have to carry the stories anymore. They're resting now, like stones settling to the bottom of a quiet river. You can float above them, weightless, safe. Take a slow breath in. Feel how your chest rises like a curtain before the first act. And as you breathe out, feel it fall, like the last bow. No applause, no rush, just release. There's nothing else to say. No more lines, no more roles, no more proving, no more pretending. You've left the stage, the lights have dimmed, and in this soft darkness, you are exactly what the Jester never got to be. Free. Stay here a while. Let the silence hold you. Let your heart beat slow. Let your fingers unclench. Let your jaw soften. Let the mask you've worn all day slip away. It's safe. You are safe. There is no king to impress, no court to entertain, no one to command your smile. There is only the pillow beneath you, the breath inside you, and the warmth slowly curling into your spine. Tomorrow will come. There will be stories to face, rooms to enter, eyes to meet. But not now. Now, there is only the softest sound, The breath between thoughts, the hush between dreams, the silence where you begin to vanish, not in fear, not in sadness, but in peace. Not every ending needs a sound. The room you're in doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be silent. It just needs to be here. And you don't need to do anything. You've already done enough. You've listened, you've felt, you've carried a quiet life in your mind and let it rest beside your own. Now, let it go. Let the story fold itself like soft fabric. Let it tuck into the corners of your thoughts. Let it cover the parts of you still tense, still waiting, still alert. They don't need to stay awake anymore. In another time, you might have been the jester, the one smiling when no one saw your eyes, the one carrying the weight of laughter on tired shoulders. But not tonight. Tonight, you are the listener, the resting one, the one no one will call upon, the one allowed to drift. The story is no longer speaking, it's breathing, and you're breathing with it. Each breath, a little longer, each pause, a little softer. The words are trailing off like mist across a sleeping garden. And your mind is already somewhere deeper, somewhere slower, somewhere darker and warmer and kinder than the world ever seems to be. Your thoughts may wander. Let them. Don't follow. Don't chase. Just let them float like paper boats on a still lake. Some will sink. Some will drift. None of them need you now. What you need is nothing. And that is enough. You are not a fool. You are not a role. You are not a voice trying to be heard. You are simply a breath, a warm shape in the dark, a pulse slowing into rhythm with the earth. You are the jester, no longer needing to make anyone laugh, no longer needing to be anything but still. And in this stillness, in this hush, in this final moment before you sleep, let the story tuck you in, like a hand smoothing the edge of a blanket, like a whisper at the end of a long day, like a promise without words. There is nothing more to say. No more kings, no more bells, no more need to be remembered. Only sleep, only rest, only you, here, now, gone.